Hi again, everyone. This is Marissa Davis, founder and principal of Tallawah Consulting. We work with mission-driven brands to help maximize their social impact by focusing on social impact, innovation, and inclusion as methods to drive their core strategy forward. And part of what we've been doing is this series called Tallawah Talks, where we have featured individuals, change makers, who have been operating at the intersection of impact and inclusion in different ways. The last season, we started off with social entrepreneurs. We featured these individuals doing work at that intersection within the social entrepreneurial sphere. And for this season, we're kicking it off by focusing on capital, focusing on the intersection of inclusion and capital. And I thought it fit for us to be able to start that conversation off by having Marcella Tillet with us. So excited to have you here with us and to help kick this conversation off. And just so you all have a better sense of who we have here gracing our virtual stage right now. Marcella, she is dedicated to working towards social justice and equity with an intersectional lens. And the way in which she has been doing that right now is as Vice President of Programs and Partnerships at the Brooklyn Community Foundation. While there, she oversees the Foundation's strategic grant-making and community leadership programs, again, focusing along with the Foundation on centering racial justice and equity, with a practice that amplifies the expertise of and fundamentally shifts the power and resources to the communities it seeks to serve and partner with those to achieve a more fair and just Brooklyn. So she has had many lives prior, not the least
Yes.
of which include with Planned Parenthood, doing some great work with them, but is a proud graduate of both Clark Atlanta and Columbia University, both where she focused first her bachelor's in social work and her master's of science in social work. And also is an adjunct professor, so teaches a course, really exciting course. The title alone, should get you excited, but called Decolonizing Social Work Practice. And this is in training graduate social work students to develop an anti-oppressive practice from anti-Black racism and racial equity lens. So really excited to have you join us today, Marcella, and
Thank you.
certainly just happy and looking forward to learning just more of your perspective on what it's like to kind of work within this space, right?
Yeah, thank you for having
So
me.
no problem, thank you. So let's get started. Capital is defined kind of broadly, in a number of different spaces, right? So capital can be leveraged in ways through philanthropy,
Hmm.
venture capital, impact investing, and even beyond that.
Yeah.
For you, where do you fall in this work? And what has inspired you to enter this space?
Yeah. So, you share that my background and professional training is as a social worker. And so I think the first thing I think about when I think about capital and impact is I think about resources that are already meant to be for the public good. So whether that is through philanthropic institutions or government resources
Mhm.
that are supposed to be providing for not just services and infrastructure, but the overall wellness of um, residents
Mhm.
and people, individuals, and communities. Um, what I'm doing now at the Community Foundation speaks to philanthropy's role in ensuring that all of the dollars that they're responsible to steward, in my case through the Brooklyn Community Foundation, are dedicated to having an impact on communities in a way that is aligned with our mission. We are very explicitly focused on recognizing the impact of racial inequities from a historical context, um, and figuring out where do we invest funds to ensure that what we're building and the work that's being done is not only kind of meeting the current needs of folks that have been deeply harmed by these systems, but
Yeah.
also working to rebuild something better in its place, right? In the place of these systems that we know don't only like not serve the needs of people, but in many cases actively harm them.
Yeah. No. And when I hear that, I think about just the space of philanthropy. That's the space that you are have been working and operating within. The world of philanthropy has existed for some time, right?
Absolutely.
And
Hmm.
has uh, the focus has been on trying to benefit communities in different ways, right? But within this context, now you're thinking about, particularly with even just mentioning your work and approach in the beginning, this uh, racial equity lens, there's an inclusive aspect to that, right? So
Absolutely.
how would you say, within the context of your work within philanthropy and with the Brooklyn Community Foundation in particular, how are you weaving inclusion in how you not only do your work but leverage the capital that is available to
Yeah.
for the benefit of these communities that you're looking to serve?
Yeah. So in our work, in our philanthropic work, when we think about what it looks like to do our work in a way that is racially equitable and takes into consideration some of the historical context that I just talked about,
Mhm.
um, we kind of have to take a step back and recognize that one of the most effective kind of tactics of oppression is marginalization and subjugation, right?
Mhm.
And so when we talk about people being marginalized, their needs, their voices, their experiences are pushed to the fringe and devalued, right? They're not considered and thought of when we're developing anything really, in a way that really brings in their true voice. So thinking about what inclusion looks like, it is not just understanding that there are people whose lives have been pushed to the margins in terms of access to the things they need to thrive, access to the opportunities um, they need to take care of themselves and their families, um, but also, the role of philanthropy and inclusion in that way is to be in relationship with people and communities that have been pushed aside. So the way we do that is being in relationship, right? Like going and talking and um, inquiring and listening. What is the experience in this community? What are the needs? What are the solutions that
Mhm.
you recommend? What are the solutions and the innovative ways that you all are surviving and finding ways to thrive in spite of the structures that don't serve you? Um, and how can we use the capital that we have to support that work, right?
Mhm.
And so we have a couple of different practices. One is a listening practice where, as I described, we have these conversations, but we take that information and attach dollars to it, attach grants to it, and we partner with community members to determine where those dollars go. So again, with the inclusion, it's not just the listening, but also the power sharing in terms of decision-making power over the allocation of resources. That is also something that is a part of our practice that we have built into the process for what grant making looks like at our foundation.
Right.
And so that inclusion is right, from the listening, from the decision making, from investing, the perspective of investing in community organizations that are led by people who reflect the identities and experiences of the communities they're serving and rooted in. All of those ways are um, kind of practices of inclusion, but also moving capital in a way that is responsive to and supportive of folks who have really been pushed to the margins.
Right. And when you even say, um, using capital in a way that is responsive, to these individuals who are being pushed to the margins. The different methods that you even speak about, the listening piece of
Hmm.
power sharing. How did you all arrive at that point, to even determine that the way to better leverage these resources is to go about it in these ways?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good question. I think this listening practice has come to us in a few different ways. The foundation in 2014 had its first big kind of listening series that is called Insights, and we just finished a recent one called Insight 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so our Insights practice is really about um, engaging with people and having conversation and really, again, listening.
Right.
But that practice is not unique to Brooklyn Community Foundation. I think we do it really well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that is a practice that exists among community foundations because of the commitment and investment in a geographic community. I think that really lends itself to understanding, okay, this is my catchment area, and I need to understand like how to prioritize, who do I need to speak to? There's a finite group of people you're talking about.
Right.
Now, for us, our finite group of people is millions of people. But
Just really finite.
yeah, just these people over here.
Right.
Um, but even having that clarity of being able to clearly define the community, right, that you're serving. And of course for us, because we have a racial equity um, kind of understanding to our work,
Mm-hmm.
we focus on communities within the broader geographic community of Brooklyn. But that listening practice is something that I think has been honed over years at different community foundations. I will say that we have taken it a step further in combining the listening practice with the participatory grant making with with the power sharing, because there are also approaches to participatory grant making that exclude power sharing. It's more consultative, right? Or it's grant makers or philanthropic institutions, or even to this to talk about government again, city budgets or state budgets that have this participatory budgeting uh, method
Mm-hmm.
will sometimes entail a fully formed budget being presented to community members for them to sign off on. It isn't um, there isn't that opportunity for that generative practice to happen in partnership,
Yeah.
and it can lack the power for there to be real change that's directed by community members. So when we do our grant making in partnership with community, we really um, are intentional about structuring a rubric and a process that assigns percentages of power across different stakeholders in that process. So it isn't, I think you have to be really careful in the design of some of these processes that you don't just kind of leave it very loose,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you leave it loose, power is going to land where it already exists.
Right.
If you're going to shift structures and shift processes and shift power, you have to be really intentional about that and hold those new parameters so that you can protect that.
Yeah.
So that's part of our approach as well.
Got you. So there is, it's almost like the unpacking of how to weave this commitment to um, racial equity and inclusion. It's layered. It is
Yep.
not just about the funneling of resources and capital to the communities, but it is very much in the very design process of how that even
Yes.
gets allocated, of how that is even um, just the grant making process overall, that it is within each of these spheres, right?
Yeah.
As part of doing this work, especially because
Mm,
you're doing it
the challenges.
differently from other kind of more traditional philanthropic institutions, there are challenges, I imagine, to being able to
Right.
do this work. So what do you see as the challenges or sort of the obstacles that you might face in trying to center um, equity and inclusion? within the context of, the philanthropic space?
So yeah, I think that centering inclusion in terms of like working with community members and community organizations in a philanthropic space, the challenge in terms of being really inclusive, I would say, is related to, and I was going to share a proverb, which I will still share. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The going together takes time, right? It is a slower process. It's a more intentional process. It's a more responsive process. And so that can be challenging in an environment, which is not specific to philanthropy, but just an environment in general, where it's all about go, go, go. You have to move fast. It's about deliverables. It's about a timeline. And if you really want to, I was just going to say, if you want to engage in, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
So I was going to say, if you really want to be focused on engaging in authentic relationship where there can be a candid sharing of feedback and input and real collaboration, trust is a big part of that. And to develop trust, it takes time, and it takes being willing to go at someone else's pace. And so I think that is one of the challenges that is a challenge, just because our systems aren't designed to accommodate that. So we have to rework our systems to adjust to the realities of what it looks like to build authentic community partnerships.
Right. And I imagine, while you say that just the timing factor and urgency is not specific to philanthropy, there's still, even within philanthropy, there's specific kind of grant giving cycles, right?
Yep.
And so when you say you have to adjust your systems and sort of processes to that, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like a grant making cycle that for the lead up to the like selection of grants and awarding and review process, that being a lot longer than if you had like one or two program officers doing it. Now you have, in some cases, over a dozen people doing it together. So there's a lot more involvement of different people. There's a lot more conversation that has to happen. And so you really have to back into it and elongate every step of the process. But the value in not just it being the right thing to do, because these are resources for the public good, and including the public and people who are meant to be beneficiaries of these funds, isn't just the right thing to do, it's the necessary thing to do, because if you want to be most effective and impactful on issues that are shaping someone's life, you want to talk to the person whose life is being shaped in large part by that issue, right? So it makes for, I think, better programming and deeper impact.
Right, which was actually going to be my next question in terms of acknowledging the challenges or sort of obstacles that you might face. What does doing, by being deliberate and intentional about centering equity and inclusion within, how you leverage resources, what does that allow you to do now that a more traditional process might not have allowed or not been able to manifest?
I think centering those things allows us to identify more grassroots organizations, invest in leaders that come from the communities and are deeply invested in the communities that they're working in and for. It allows us to really tap into innovation that's happening. The most innovative kind of solutions I've seen to issues have come through crisis. Even if we just look at the past year, some of the things we've been able to do to meet our basic needs and to kind of keep things going, for better or worse, has relied on deep innovation and adaptability. And so when you look into communities that have had to not just find ways to survive, but, cultivate ways to not just meet their basic needs, but like have joy and have culture and have, this spirit that relies on innovation, that relies on resilience. And I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned there, and a lot of investment, really smart investment to be made there. But you miss that if you're not in relationship, right? You miss that if you're not listening, and you miss that if you're not being inclusive.
Right, and it sounds like you miss that also if you're just looking at time, because oftentimes within the context of innovation, speed is what gets associated with it. And
Yep.
what you seem to be suggesting is that innovation can also come out of just being intentional about making space for these ideas to come up that may have not been surfaced prior because there just wasn't attention paid to maybe the individuals either doing it or how they were going about doing it.
Yeah.
So that also makes me think about the flip side of my question before, which so I had asked you even prior about the challenges that you see. Like, what do you see as the opportunities, in leveraging capital in this way, by being intentional in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities that come with being intentional about focusing on values of racial equity and inclusion, I think for us, it has made us re-examine what tools we have, right? Of course, we have capital, but how are we thinking about using that capital? We have, and I've been learning from other foundations who engage in impact investing, so that, yes, they're having an impact in how they distribute capital through grant making, but also the way that their endowments are invested, the way that they are either involved in grantee pools or investing in small businesses that impact their local communities. You just have this like 2 and 3 and 4-fold return in terms of impact. I think those are the really exciting opportunities. And for me, I'm excited to learn more in that space and grow into that space in a more robust way, because I think capital isn't everything, but it can sure lead to a lot of good. Right. It can kind of turn over a couple of times and have impacts that if you're being creative, you would miss if you're not paying attention.
Yeah, no, totally. There sounds like there are some otherwise missed opportunities in not being deliberate and focusing on it's not just equity, it's not just inclusion, it's kind of the combination of all of that, right? And you just started touching on this, so you've probably kind of spoken about this to some degree, but you started speaking about impact, right?
Yeah.
And so as you're looking to the opportunities that are both present now and soon to be, what does impact look like, within your work, especially as we think not just about the philanthropic space, but just broadly, everyone is talking about measuring impact and defining what impact is. Yeah. So what does that look like for that you all do?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways to look at it. We definitely have areas of focus that we concentrate on, like, the experiences of older adults in Brooklyn, youth leadership and development, protecting the rights and well-being of immigrants in Brooklyn. So there's a couple of different spaces we have a kind of hyper focus on. But if I take a step back from that and think about impact more broadly, I think, again, the desired impact has to be defined by the people and communities where that impact resides, right? So I think that's one shift in how we should think about impacts, because oftentimes the person or entity with the power or the resources gets to define what the impact should be, how it should be measured, what we're working towards, and then perhaps we bring in folks through an inclusive practice that will carry out, the activities that'll have the intended impact. We like to turn that a bit on its head so we can have like kind of areas of focus, but within that, we really rely on our community partners to define what is the desired outcomes and impact of the work that you do, and how can we be supportive of that. So it's very individualized from area to area, organization to organization, working towards broader goals, but we think it's important for that agency to be respected, in terms of agency, in terms of like autonomy, right? Not just agency in terms of an entity or institution. Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. So then I imagine that changes or informs what the impact measurement process looks like, right? It's not top down, but from the community up,
right?
Which has all kinds of implications.
Yeah.
So
what that oftentimes looks like is more of a qualitative, anecdotal expression of change and impact in the short term. But again, we're trying to focus on equity. And so that's something you see over the long term. That's something you see with structures and systems transforming to create greater access for people who have not had that access to the things that they need, and things that they need to be well. And so there's kind of like a balance of both of those things. In the short term, we'll see that community defined outcome in very qualitative ways, I think, a rich description of how life and experiences are changing for the people and communities that they work with. But then as we, over time, look at the outcomes on a more aggregate level of what are the conditions in that community, what are the conditions for a particular group of people, whether we're talking about young people or older adults or immigrants or some other specified group. We want to be able to see those trends moving in the direction of wellness across different aspects of life.
Gotcha. Yeah, and thinking about, I'm sure having some kind of baseline for what existed before, and those criteria for wellness, might look like. No, that's great stuff, and it's oftentimes, I think just within some of the philanthropic spaces more broadly is not often the dynamic. So often they're individuals who are trying to fit within a structure that has already been set and created for them, and when they're trying to speak to some of the outcomes that have happened that aren't necessarily being asked for, there's sometimes a disconnect with trying to get the funds that are needed to address the issue, but not necessarily being seen as the most, I guess, grant fit, for that entity. So it sounds like trying to kind of address that gap as well.
Yeah. So that whole square peg round hole issue you're talking about, we try not to have a round hole. We try to just have a big old space, and again, we benefit from having a geographic focus where our space is Brooklyn, and that, and then within that, we're focusing on, communities, largely Black communities and other communities of color, to ensure that there is that space for them to define their own needs, to find their own solutions, and have the investment to make those things happen.
No, awesome. No, so I think that leads me to, I guess, my final question here, which is, when it's all said and done, right? When you have put in the work, with the foundation, and having done the work of really prioritizing and centering inclusion and equity within, both how you funnel the resources and just the process for distributing that. What does, I was initially going to ask, what does success look like? but I'm going to use your language. You know, what does transformation look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, you know, if we're talking grand terms, what does transformation look like? It looks like liberation, right?
Liberation, you said.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now that doesn't come at the end of a grant cycle,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if we, again, take a step back and ask, what are we doing? What are we working towards? It is not to give people the resources they need or kind of shift resources back to people so that they can live better in their same deplorable conditions that have been, you know, kind of created for them, but how to shift conditions, right? So that liberation is possible. And wellness is possible. And when I talk about wellness, yes, I'm talking about physical and mental wellness, but also like economic wellness and, you know, ability to have the things that you need. That doesn't exist at the end of a grant cycle. That doesn't exist at the end of a, you know, an organization saying like, these are our goals for the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
This is the investment that the foundation is contributing to the achievement of those goals. And it's like, okay, great, we did these, you know, core set of things. Mm-hmm. And that is working towards this broader, greater good of the transformation we want to see to the end of. Yeah, I mean, even just thinking about it makes me smile when I think about transformation and wellness and liberation and all of that. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's why we do this work, and that's you know, why we try to create the processes and the relationships that we do in such an intentional way,
Right.
because that is what we're leaning towards.
Yeah.
You know, we're leaning towards justice. We're leaning towards equity.
Yeah, and leaning towards it sounds like a space where people can be seen and made whole. You know, that like the fullness of who they are and what they offer in the world. You know, there's
Mm-hmm.
space for that, or there are no limits to what that can look
Right.
like. Yeah.
Right.
No, awesome. No, thank you so much. You know, for taking the time to
Absolutely.
chat with us, and certainly I'd be curious to know, you know, is there anything, you know, based on just all the work that you've done so far, and an example, you know, that you might have to offer of sort of an exemplary kind of representation of this being done well, you know, like something that you're really proud of and with the work.
Yeah. Let me think. So I would say a process that I'm proud of, and we're in the midst of it, so I can't speak about the outcome, but the work we're doing with older adults, that has really served as a model for the expansion of that practice in the other areas of our work. And it has started with those listening sessions with, you know, communities of older adults in different parts of the borough to hear what their lived experiences are, to hear what their needs and solutions and challenges are. And then to be able to secure a pot of funding to that end, and then work with older adults from Brooklyn, you know, who have built their life here and are living here as older adults, which can be challenging and great, right? Because they have their whole community of networks and activities, and they are thriving. And even just kind of being with them in this work gives me something to look forward to in my old age of really being impactful and still very invested in my community. But to be able to work with them and have them shape our process and shape how we assess the impact that community organizations are having. Because what I see as, oh, well, it looks like they're doing good work and their approach seems to be, you know, fitting to the population of people they work with, is going to be very different than, you know, what one of our advisors, who may be, you know, 70-year-old Black woman who's lived in Brooklyn all of her life, she's going to look at that with a different lens. She's going to bring a different eye to that work and to those conversations. And so having the benefit of that wisdom and expertise has, I think, made a better kind of investment, right? There's a pool of organizations that we're investing these grants in so that they can work towards these goals of bettering the outcomes of life for older adults in Brooklyn. And now we're supporting those organizations alongside our advisors. We're just about to schedule some of the support visits to talk about how things are going, what are they seeing, especially after a year that's been so deeply impactful to all of us in Brooklyn, but particularly our older adults. I'm glad that we have made those investments in the organization. So I would say that process, the level of inclusion and partnership that exists in that process is something I'm very proud of.
No, that's awesome. And focusing on a community segment that, our senior folks aren't always, point of focus. So
Yeah.
And the intersection, senior folks who are also
Absolutely
marginalized in other ways. And I think that is to your point where that inclusive lens matters.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a great place to end. And certainly, is there anything else that you would like to share that you haven't already?
Not in particular. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, Brooklyn Community Foundation is a place where folks of all asset sizes can come and make donations and support our work, particularly if the things that I've just described are resonant with them. Consider making a donation and supporting the great work we're doing in Brooklyn.
Yep, and great work that needs to be supported. So yeah, again, thank you. It's such a pleasure, Marcella. And
thank you for having me.
Wish you all the continued best as you and the rest of the Brooklyn Community Foundation team will continue to be leaders in just focusing on making equity and inclusion a priority, and not an afterthought. So
absolutely. Thank you.